Welcome to Dot Point S8, and today we're looking at describing the impacts of historical land use practices on the development of Australian agricultural systems. So this is divided into three parts, and you will have done this in Year 11 as well in the overview topic when you looked at, you did an assessment on Indigenous and early European and more sustainable practices. So it's divided into the three categories, and you really need to look at some from all three. So the first one is Indigenous, and obviously that's mostly prior to 1788. Early European practices are basically from the arrival of the first fleet into Australia up until kind of somewhere in the 1960s to 1980s roughly, and then these more sustainable techniques which we're currently using somewhere from kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, somewhere around there when they kind of began. So here we have examples here in photos. We've got Feisty Farming as an example, Indigenous practice. We've got land clearing, which was an early European practice and is still in some small parts used today, particularly in Queensland, where we clear large areas of land to put crops on or animals for grazing. And then here's an example of green manuring, which is considered a sustainable practice, which is planting crops or planting plants simply to plow them back into the soil to break down and provide nutrients. So basically, not in any particular order here, we have two from each time period. So if we start with the Indigenous ones here, we've got fire-stick farming. So it was Indigenous and fire was used to burn surrounding bushland, and the reason it was done was to regenerate plants, and plants would then grow back again and be more vigorous, and also it would allow them to hunt animals when they came out because of the fire. So the positives here are ash from the burnt plants operate as fertilizer, increasing carbon, and as soon as it rains, it increases the productivity of the soil. It also assists in the regeneration and reproduction of plants. So Banksia can only release seeds from its pods under extreme heat, and it reduces the risk of large-scale bushfires. The negatives are that it's impractical on a commercial large scale, and then it also requires heavy surveillance and planning so that the fire doesn't get out of control. Another Indigenous practice was a kind of hunter-gatherer practice, and basically it means constantly moving around from season to season based on food supply. Now, this certainly wasn't what all Indigenous people did prior to European arrival, but it is certainly something that happened with some, maybe not many. But basically, it's moving around and finding food in different places in different seasons. So basically, the impact of the practice on land is that the environment is not overworked. In certain areas, they're not over hunting or hunting out animals to extinction, hopefully. There's obviously no chemicals used, and the land has a long period to recover from any hunting, and of which would have been minimal anyway. But the negatives are you're kind of reliant on the land being looked after by other people, and also it's not practical on a commercial scale, and with the number of people we now have in Australia. Early European practices, so one of them is continuous cultivation. So it involves constantly ploughing soil, lots of machinery running over the soil and turning over the soil and breaking down the soil structure. So on the positive sides, it was done to help loosen and aerate soil and allow for deeper root penetration. It also incorporates manure and fertilizers into the soil. On the downsides, the soil loses moisture and becomes more prone to wind and rain erosion. Loss of soil organic matter reduces microorganisms and bacteria and reduces insulation of the soil, and soil structure is lost and you get stunted germination and growth. Another early European practice was land clearing. So it was removing large amounts of vegetation to allow it to be used for growing crops and grazing animals. And so obviously positive is it creates lots of space, allowing that to happen on a commercial scale, but number of negatives in terms of their impact on the land. Obviously encourages the spread of invasive species and weeds over large areas. You get deforestation of habitats for wildlife, which end up dying or reducing in number, and the use of machinery obviously releases carbon emissions. Two more modern sustainable practices are minimum tillage or reduced tillage or even zero tillage. So this means we're using ploughing on the soil much less machinery on the soil, less breakdown of the soil structure. And so positives are increasing soil organic matter because more material is left on the surface, like stubble after crops, which encourages microorganisms to grow. Another positive is soil structure being maintained more and not breaking down soil structure, and allows for better root development eventually over the long term. It's going to have lower maintenance costs because you're using less machinery. On the negative side, it's the lack of weed control unless you're using chemicals. The last sustainable practice is grazing management. So it is basically rotating, or another grazing rotation might be another way of putting it. You're basically rotating the use of pastures between fallow, livestock, and crops, and this allows the fallow allows for pasture to recover, and the paddock's not being used for anything productive, and it allows increased growth. Grazing animals can be used to help prepare soil for sowing, reduce the amount of forage, but still leave organic matter from feces, etc., and urine. Also, it increases the levels of carbon and nitrogen as something might be grown just to break down, such as a green manuring crop. On the downside, it's expensive. It requires fencing and a lot more knowledge and management, more labor, etc. And then also animals and crops have to be chosen for a specific reason, and it might involve changing what you have. So questions for this dot point: 2015, what is the land use practice that was commonly used by Aboriginal inhabitants? Feisty farming is the correct answer there. Which of the following statements is true of early European land management practices? They led to an increase in soil degradation issues is the correct answer. And for 6 marks here, compare techniques used to manage the nutrient level of soils in the mid-20th century to those currently used. I've answered this elsewhere as well, but here's another one. Nutrient levels refer to soil fertility, which means the ability of the soil to sustain agricultural plant growth. Early 1900s techniques such as widespread use of inorganic fertilizers such as superphosphate have been used to quickly and significantly increase soil nutrient levels and hence fertility, in this case phosphorus. However, it also leads to problems such as nutrient leaching and eutrophication of waterways. Positively, though, it does provide required nutrients to plants at exactly the phase of plant growth required. Modern sustainable practices such as the use of crop rotations with legumes help improve long-term levels of soil nutrients, particularly nitrogen over a longer period, particularly available to the next crop. While this is more sustainable, it is less detrimental to waterways. It takes longer to obtain. Now, this question is really mostly answered off a dot point coming up on water quality and different techniques. So it's probably better if you hold off on answering this question till later. I just threw it in here because you might be able to use something from this dot point, but it's mostly answered from another dot point shortly.